Arsenal were rudderless. Their figurehead was gone, so too any resemblance of a clear direction, and the new coach was hardly making friends from the dugout. In the background, however, David Dein had a scheme up his sleeve, one that he had cherished even before the days of Anfield '89. He knew a man who knew a thing or two about football, and finally the time was right to unleash him on the Premier League. This time it wasn't just Arsenal who were about to become modern, but the entire league. This is a story of Arsene Wenger's Arsenal, of the double-double and the Invincibles. Arsenal were instrumental in creating a Super League of sorts when the chairman from the Big Five of the day, Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Tottenham Hotspur and Everton, coincided to revolutionise football, with the backbone being more television money and a cleaner product. We all saw Italia 90, well I didn't, I wasn't born yet, but you get what I mean, and we were all captivated by the product. After Heysel, England were lagging so far behind that they could have barely had a league, a national team or a crop of players that could compete amongst the second-tier nations, never mind the elite. This was about to change, and Arsenal needed to change with it, no matter how successful they had become under George Graham. As the 90s crept into view and that little Premier League lion prepared its voice box to roar in excitement, Arsenal were collecting a team. They'd snapped up David Seaman to complete the holy quintuple backline, whilst continuing to rely on the heroes of Anfield, being Paul Merson, David Rocastle and Alan Smith, to name a few. After collecting a second league title in 3 years, just in time for Arsenal to appear in only their second ever European Cup campaign and the onset of greater sums of money, the Gunners prized Ian Wright away from Crystal Palace. The final piece of a potential jigsaw, the schoolboy friend of David Rocastle, was the biggest club piece of business at £2.5 million. Money well spent when, 6 years later, he toppled the great Cliff Bastin as the club's top scorer. That record wouldn't last, however, and more on that later, of course. Arsenal were league champions, they were competing in the European Cup, and the Premier League was around the corner. Everything should have been rosy. Then came the shock of a last 16 exit to Benfica before the group stages could even commence. A limp defence of their title transformed into the first Premier League campaign's best defensive record. Not that many cheered that fact. The football was dire. Much like in the malaise after the double winning year of 71, Arsenal had become content with becoming a cup team, defeating Sheffield Wednesday not only for the League Cup but also the FA Cup, and being a cup winner in this time meant the Cup Winners' Cup. And again, Arsenal cleaned up, defeating Parma, but once more, the true barometer was in the league, where they finished an improved fourth, but nowhere near the pace setters of Blackburn and champions Manchester United. Young English talent was coming through, with Martin Keown collected back and Ray Parlour being promoted from the academy, but it wasn't enough. There hadn't been the overhaul needed to move on from such a golden few years. The club, famed for doing the right thing, the proper thing, weren't pulling their weight on and off the pitch. Off it, Tony Adams had been jailed for 8 weeks and was in the mire of an all-encompassing alcoholism, whilst Paul Merson suffered from his own vices. The club's infamous Tuesday Club only exacerbated these ails. Not even the cool, calm, collected George Graham was immune. After it was alleged he had taken a bung to facilitate a transfer, he had to go in February 1995. With another Cup Winners' Cup final and mid-table finish around the corner, the rot had definitely sunk in. Vice Chair David Dein knew just the man to take them into the new cosmopolitan era of the Premier League. But one catch, he couldn't have him just yet. Arsene Wenger was born in Strasbourg and was handed the best of both worlds. Growing up on the French-West German border, he spoke both languages and could gain a footballing education from either France or West Germany. Whilst he was destined to be born into the professional game in Strasbourg, Wenger admired those from over the border and the Bundesliga's Borussia Mönchengladbach. They dominated West German football, and it was the Germans' uber-professionalism that piqued Wenger's interest in nutrition. As a player, Wenger was aggressively average and amounted to very little. However, his future was incredibly predictable just as soon as he began to take training sessions from the ripe age of 16. Whilst his playing career was petering out, Wenger already had one eye on his next move as he took Strasbourg's reserve team before earning his first managerial qualifications in 1981. His first senior role came at AS Nancy, where his penchant for lucid attacking football and strict conditioning regimes helped improve the team. The penniless club forced Wenger to recruit from within, and despite relegation, there was promise in the young manager. He was rewarded for his hard work when he was offered the Monaco job. Finally, he could spend some money, and after bringing the English duo Mark Hateley and Glenn Hoddle, as well as French international star Patrick Battiston, Monaco surged to the title in Wenger's debut season. Wenger, however, would quickly become disillusioned with French football because of the financial might of Bernard Tapie's Marseille, as well as their illegal transactions and underhanded tactics as they swept through the national game and eventually to the Champions League title. Meanwhile, Wenger had to make do with the crumbs of a Coupe de France in '91 and subsequent Cup Winners' Cup final defeat to Werder Bremen 12 months later. One of Wenger's final acts at Monaco was guiding the club to the Champions League semi-final in 1994, earned in the place of the disqualified Marseille before Wenger slinked off to Japan. He coached Nagoya Grampus 8 in the burgeoning J-League, a tantalising prospect to cleanse his palate from the dirt of the French game, as well as broadening his horizons. Whilst in the Far East, he learnt new methods in conditioning and was joined by fellow disgruntled coach Boro Primorac, who'd be his long-term number 2. Wenger's future, however, was elsewhere. In early 1989, he found himself with a layover between Istanbul and Paris in London. A spare evening in a foreign country, and so he did what only he knew best, found a football club, got a ticket and managed to get a seat in the executive areas at Highbury. It was North London Derby Day. When it became clear to the higher-ups that the Monaco manager was in part of the VIP areas, the French-speaking David Dein had to get a word. The night started with light banter and an Arsenal victory. It ended with Wenger going back to Dean's place and the two becoming lifelong friends. The vice-chair would often travel south to watch Wenger's matches in Monaco, and from the off, he was hooked. There was just one problem. Appointing a foreign manager bizarrely as late as the mid-90s was still considered a taboo subject. Some had tried and all of them had failed. Aston Villa delved into the continent to bring Josef Venglos to Villa Park, but the Czech manager barely lasted a year and was ultimately unsuccessful. Ozzy Ardiles went in at Spurs and delivered fascinating and attacking football, but he too did not cut it. Factor in that Ardiles was a club legend for his exploits in the 70s and 80s, it could be said that only really 1.5 prominent foreigners had recently taken control of prominent football clubs in England. When George Graham was sacked, Dean had floated Arsene Wenger's name as a possible replacement. Ultimately, the rest of the board were on edge about appointing a Frenchman, and so the decision was made to acquire Bolton's Bruce Rioch, as Arsene Wenger remained in Japan with Nagoya Grampus 8. After Bruce Rioch alienated Arsenal's players in his brief tenure and didn't get his team to perform on the pitch, he was gone. The names touted as his replacement were as grand as Barcelona coach Johan Cruyff and recent Euro '96 semi-finalist Terry Venables. Therefore, when Wenger's name was announced, it was met with discontent. Then came the headlines of Arsene Who, the salacious and libelous rumours about his private life and the disparaging quotes from Alex Ferguson. One being, they say he's intelligent, I've got a boy from the Ivory Coast who also speaks 5 languages. Another being, he should keep his opinions to Japanese football. This was a positive. It meant that Wenger had crept under the skin of the most successful Premier League manager, and it meant Arsenal were going places. And to go places, Arsene Wenger had to change the culture. First and foremost, the players were banned from drinking. Out went the pints of Stella Artois, in came the supplements and vitamins that players were free to take or not take. Some dabbled, others swore by it, a few rejected the move. Whichever camp you were in, the club was sufficiently changed for the better. Wenger kick-started the cliché of a new manager banning the devil's sugary muck known as tomato ketchup before swapping the pre-match meals of eggs, chips and beans, a British classic, for the regimented boiled chicken, the honest green veg and the backbone of pasta. He did allow his players some luxuries. They kept their jam, only now it was diabetic jam, and they could still have milk in their tea, but if they were to have milk in their tea, then he would supervise the distribution of sugar into the tea. If the sugar was unevenly placed into the tea, it would be unevenly distributed into the bloodstream, and therefore a player risked a sugar crash. Seriously. He timed training sessions to the millisecond, not allowing sessions to drag on, and incorporated long stretching routines and yoga. Again, some partook, some found the benefits, it didn't matter. Enough changed, so Arsenal did. Admittedly, Wenger had a bit of a head start in making wholesale changes. Dennis Bergkamp was signed for a club record £7.5 million, and with his acquisition, the professionalism went up a notch. Also see a returning David Platt from Italy. He had come from the schools of Amsterdam and Milan, where he had looked after his body, not drunk or fell into the vices that some of the Arsenal players had done. Tony Adams and Paul Merson, for example, who went public with their problems in an attempt to stop their addiction from ruining their careers. Both would go teetotal, enter rehabs, and by the time Wenger officially arrived in the autumn of '96, the club was in a far healthier place. Others might have taken the hint that the burning down of Arsenal's training facilities shortly after Wenger's arrival and left. However, the destruction of Arsenal's base, which they shared with a local university, was arguably one of the best things to ever happen to Wenger and the club. He detested that such an enormous football team didn't have their own dedicated facilities, and by the time plans were in place to build from scratch, Arsenal had the money and Wenger had his feet under the table. He could cast his micromanaging eye over the entire project, and exactly that is what he did. It was the final piece in the puzzle in dragging both Arsenal and English football into the 21st century. The Premier League was changing, and after the 1994 World Cup in the United States, there became an acceptance of more foreign talent. Arsenal were at the forefront of such a revolution. Patrick Vieira and Remy Gard were the first French players out of the block, signed on the advice of Wenger before he got out of his contract in Japan. Then, once the manager was installed at Highbury, he went into overdrive. Emmanuel Petit and Marc Overmars completed the 1997-98 team. Nicola Anelka, meanwhile, was designed for the future midway through that successful campaign. Ultimately, however, Anelka paid for two of Wenger's greatest accomplishments, the acquisition of Thierry Henry and the new London Colney facilities. As defending double holders in the summer of '98, Wenger delivered Freddie Ljungberg before the millennium brought with it Robert Pires on the adjacent flank. Pires was joined by another Frenchman in an offensive area, one Thierry Henry, the man who would break Ian Wright's short-lived goal-scoring record. In winning the FA Cup from Newcastle United in 1998 and an end-of-season surge above and beyond Manchester United, thanks in part to a Marc Overmars winner at Old Trafford, the Premier League was changing in other ways. Manchester United and Alex Ferguson had their contenders, but in the first flurry of Norwich City and Aston Villa, as well as the moneyed Blackburn Rovers and entertaining Newcastle United, they all quickly revealed themselves as pretenders. Whilst other members of the Big Five struggled to adapt in the Premier League and the return of European football, Manchester United soared to the heights of dominance in the league's first few years. Arsene Wenger, therefore, was the first true opposition to this tidal wave. The backline was not touched, since the one thing that Arsenal could actually boast about in the Premier League era was their defensive record. They just had to change the dour, boring football and inject it with a bit of va-va-voom up front, and this was Wenger's job. The long slogs of football matches were transformed with the impudence of Patrick Vieira and Emmanuel Petit, who could run a match both physically and technically. Either side of them were deeply technical players. Freddie Ljungberg transformed from a wandering number 10 into a right-sided midfielder who could both create and score. Marc Overmars was quicksilver down the left, and when he was replaced by Pires, the goals and creativity didn't relent from the left. Those who strayed from a 4-4-2 were the most successful in the Premier League's first knock-ins, while some like Arsenal themselves and Liverpool briefly attempted and were successful with a back three. The best mode of divergent tactics lay in the number 10. Before Wenger even took to the dugout, he had tried to influence Arsenal's tactics. Midway through a UEFA Cup tie with his beloved Borussia Mönchengladbach, Wenger marched from the stands into the dressing room and told his team to revert to a defensive 4. Arsenal were swiftly eliminated. Wenger relented for his first season, but by the time the squad reconvened for the 97-98 campaign, the 4-4-2 was in. Or rather, the 4-4-1-1. Just as Gianfranco Zola and Eric Cantona had found success between the lines, Dennis Bergkamp was born to carry out the same duties on the football pitch. He would create for Ian Wright and Nicola Anelka, but also help himself to a number of important goals, famously occupying first, second and third in a Goal of the Month competition. Everything was in place, the players were healthier, hungrier and the tactics suited them. The football was cagey at the back and scintillating up top. The perfect blend to go for an unprecedented double-double, just as Ferguson's Manchester United had done, only this time it would be in successive seasons. Cut to the business end of the 98-99 season. Wenger and Ferguson were going to the wire in both domestic competitions, whilst United still had the Champions League to fight for. As United hurtled full speed towards Barcelona, there was the feasible possibility that they could wind up with nothing. A cagey FA Cup semi-final ended goalless between the pair at Villa Park. The Premier League title was destined to be decided on the final day, and a game of enormous proportions back at Villa Park in the last ever FA Cup semi-final replay awaited. David Beckham whipped an impeccable first for Man United. Dennis Bergkamp replied in the second half with a drilled effort from the same area before Roy Keane saw red for a challenge on Mark Overmars, and Ray Parlour was felled in the box by Phil Neville. The 90th minute saw Bergkamp stood eye to eye with Schmeichel. The winner would surely go on to complete the domestic double and possibly determine the winner of the Champions League. Schmeichel guessed correctly, and with the game plunged into extra time, Patrick Vieira erroneously gave Ryan Giggs the ball, and the entirety of English football was changed forever. The loss prompted a reboot for Arsenal. They lost the league title on the final day and the subsequent 2 championships as the newly knighted Sir Alex Ferguson ascended to heights that not even Herbert Chapman could manage. A couple of bad moves in the transfer market, unlucky with injuries, silver medals in the finals of the UEFA Cup in 2000 and FA Cup in 2001, and the momentum was no longer with the Gunners. It needed a seismic shift to disrupt the very fabric of the game. The players were certainly there. Ashley Cole was coming through the academy at left back, David Seaman still kept goal, Patrick Vieira still anchored the midfield, now alongside Ray Parlour, whilst Lundberg created from the right, Bergkamp centrally, and Thierry Henry had moved into a rich vein of goal-scoring form. Lauren was coming into his own at right back, and after a difficult season, Robert Pires was due to find his feet on the left. Then, the bombshell. Tony Adams had been clinging on to his place in the centre of defence alongside Martin Keown, who was ageing himself, and both needed to be replaced. What nobody envisaged possible was the man to be Tottenham Hotspur captain Sol Campbell on a free transfer. After months of incognito meetings in David Dean's back garden, Campbell was finally assured that he could choose to hop over that rarely treaded North London fence and remain in the Premier League. The response was predictably vitriolic. Campbell suffered for his desire to attain more than just the 1999 League Cup in his trophy cabinet. Ultimately, he was immediately vindicated. Pires and Henry were in stupendous form, Vieira too, whilst even Parlour found an incredible purple patch to run the midfield and score an impeccable goal that settled the FA Cup final. Factor in another chasing down of Manchester United, equipped with another 1-0 win at Old Trafford that this time confirmed the title in Manchester, and it was some rebound. Arsenal were back on top, and now they had to prove that they could stay there. They couldn't, but they were probably the best team England had to offer in the 2002-03 season. Wenger moved silently but quick in the transfer market to acquire Colo Touré and Gilberto Silva, filling the two problem areas of centre-half and central midfield. Colo Touré was on a trial contract when he enthusiastically joined in with a training session, flying full-blooded into tackles, one of which famously ended with Arsene Wenger downed and requiring treatment. Off the back of this alone, he was signed and retrained to form the new-look backline, just as Lauren had been when he moved from right midfield to right back. To Touré's side, he could find the experience of Sol Campbell as his defensive partner, and slightly above him, a World Cup winner. Gilberto Silva was signed off the back of a triumphant World Cup campaign that summer in the Far East of Asia. He was exactly the type of defensively minded partner that could allow Patrick Vieira to get back to his best. Vieira had been continually touted by Europe's best, such as Barcelona, Juventus and Real Madrid, throughout his Arsenal career. Whilst Wenger had a knack for knowing when to dispense of players, from Nicolas Anelka to Petit and Overmars for sizable fees, he knew he could not risk losing Vieira. The others he could replace and add to the squad. Vieira, it was patently clear, he could not. Alternatively, David Seaman was a telegraphed outgoing that had yet to be replaced and was well on his way to playing his final matches for the club. He was the major talking point in England's exit from the World Cup that summer, just as Tony Adams had been in 1988, but this was a player low on confidence and towards the tail end of his career. The seemingly idealistic signing of Richard Wright as his successor hadn't quite worked out, and Wenger would put that problem on the back burner until the 2002-03 season was over. Arsenal had been imperious on the road towards the back end of the prior campaign. Their long unbeaten run continued through the early stages of the subsequent season as title rivals Manchester United floundered. Two things perhaps took the season down a completely different route. The first was Wayne Rooney and his incredible debut goal in the Premier League, scored in the last minute at Goodison Park in October, which culled Arsenal's invincible streak. This shortly after Wenger proclaimed that he could envision an unbeaten season for his players. Whilst that didn't come true, nor did the retention of the Premier League, Arsenal were once again playing the best football in the division and ran the eventual champions, led by Sir Alex Ferguson of course, incredibly close. They would have to settle for the FA Cup in a 1-0 win over Southampton. The subsequent summer was a quiet one, as Manchester United prepared for life after David Beckham and snatched Cristiano Ronaldo from under Arsenal's noses. The Gunners were content with just one acquisition prior to the immortal 2003-04 season. Jens Lehmann, similarly coming towards the end of his career, would replace David Seaman in goal. The German, however, had a fire still remaining. Some say a bit too much, but it was an act of completing the team. The first 11 was settled, and with players like Sylvain Wiltord, Pascal Sigan, Ray Parlour, as well as the newly acquired Felipe Senderos, Gael Clichy and Jose Antonio Reyes filling out the depth, Arsenal were ready to go. After 4 August wins came the fortune from 12 yards that was September. Growing desperate after the newly promoted Portsmouth had gone one up thanks to Teddy Sheringham of all players, Robert Pires took a bit of a theatrical tumble in the box to win an unjust penalty. Thierry Henry converted and Arsenal slinked off with a point. The reverse was true 8 days later, when Arsenal and Manchester United met at Old Trafford, where once the tie was dominated by class in a football and physical sense, now it had become clear that there was a real hatred between the two sets of players. The FA Cup tie at the same ground earlier on in the year, won by Edu, was a feisty affair that could have seen multiple red cards. In the league fixture some 7 months on, there was a red card after Patrick Vieira lashed out at Ruud van Nistelrooy. Despite not making any contact, Vieira was shown red and the fuse was lit. Van Nistelrooy won an even softer penalty in stoppage time, which left Wenger's vision balancing on a knife edge. The Dutchman rarely missed. He was a reigning Golden Boot winner and proficient from 12 yards. Arsenal, however, had clearly got under his skin when he lashed at his spot kick. It struck the bar, the full-time whistle blew, Arsenal's unbeaten start was preserved, but that was just the beginning. Van Nistelrooy was in the middle of an Arsenal maelstrom as Ashley Cole, Lauren and Ray Parlour tore strips from him before the infamous Martin Keown clothesline to the back of the head. The affair had descended into farce, the game had finished, but the Battle of Old Trafford was only just getting going. Fines and suspensions were dished out to both sides, with Arsenal taking the brunt of the sordid event. It galvanised the squad ahead of 5 incredibly important games, and Arsenal won the lot. Each of their nearest rivals for the title in Newcastle, Liverpool, Chelsea and Leeds were beaten, whilst geographical rivals Spurs were also slain. They remained with a 0 in their loss column and now had the backbone, the confidence and momentum to plough on through those winter months and carry out the undefeated season. Even on the continent where their tetchy domestic period coincided with 1 point after 3 group games against Inter, Lokomotiv Moscow and Dynamo Kyiv, Arsenal's form relaxed them in the Champions League as well. With a mountain still to climb to qualify, Arsenal got back on track with a slender win over the Ukrainians before perhaps their greatest ever display under Wenger. The daunting trip to San Siro, comfortably the most difficult in the group, was next, and Arsenal swatted them aside, scoring 5, and qualification for the knockout stage was all but confirmed. Dropped points against teams like Fulham and Leicester, whilst another draw away to the thorn in their side, otherwise known as Bolton Wanderers, was the only thing keeping Manchester United top of the league in January. When United lost their best defender Rio Ferdinand to a lengthy ban and chucked in a defeat at Molineux against the doomed Wolves, Arsenal took solace and strung together 9 wins on the spin. We were about to enter April and there was still a 0 in that loss column. The sternest test to that were the visiting Manchester United. Whilst they had crashed out of the League Cup semi-finals, thwarting a never-before-seen quadruple in English football, Arsenal had booked their place in the FA Cup semi-final against the Red Devils and had 1 foot in the Champions League Final Four thanks to an away goal and a draw at Stamford Bridge. Only a late Louis Saha goal thwarted them in the league. The draw all but took United out of the contention, but they still had the tools to harm them. By the time Arsenal next played in the Premier League 2 weeks later, their world had turned completely upside down. If the Villa Park semi-final of '99 was a classic, the 2004 sequel was brutish. Paul Scholes settled the tie with a typically thunderous strike as Wenger felt the pinch of the schedule, resting Thierry Henry. Then Wayne Bridge served to settle a cagey Champions League encounter with a late winner at Highbury. Whilst Chelsea would bow out at the next round, Arsenal were beaten in domestic competition, only by those who would go on to lift the respective trophies in Middlesbrough and Manchester United. Wenger then was left with the almighty task of picking his players up ahead of the Liverpool match at Highbury on Good Friday. 2-1 down at half-time, there was the chance that Arsenal's implosion was about to continue. With a run of fixtures that read Newcastle, Leeds and Spurs in the coming weeks, it was far from ideal. Then came another turning point in a miraculous season. Thierry Henry twisted Jamie Carragher's blood inside out and scored. His hat-trick was the catalyst to get Arsenal to the title. Chelsea were limp rivals in the first campaign of the Roman Abramovich ownership, and all Arsenal had to do now was maintain control, with more than an eye on that loss column. A point was taken from Newcastle and mesmeric Henry smashed 4 beyond Leeds, which left the unthinkable joy of winning the title on their neighbours' patch. They had done so in 1971 on the final day of the season. This, though, was a less pressured environment, as Arsenal needed just a point and had 4 more games afterwards to do so. When Patrick Vieira stole an early first and Robert Pires snatched the second, the title was all but sealed. Jamie Redknapp got one back and only a petulant Jens Lehmann could thwart the desired win, when his foul left Spurs with the penalty that granted them a late point. It didn't matter, the Lucozade bottles were out in replacement for champagne corks, and Arsenal players partied to the one corner of White Hart Lane that remained full. Arsenal had won the league. And with 4 matches left on the clock, now the tag of Invincibles had become an albatross around their neck. They couldn't relax, they had 4 games in 16 days where they could create history. They would become the second English team to go an entire season unbeaten, and let's be honest with ourselves here, Preston did it in a 22-game season in the 1880s. It only counts statistically. It didn't count in actuality. Deepdale still bears the scars of this injustice that Preston are the first invincible team in English football. I went a few months back and saw it all. Total madness. Anyway, Arsenal had trips to Portsmouth and Fulham either side of home ties with Birmingham and Leicester, matches where the full 12 points would barely be a thought running through the Arsenal supporters' minds. A cagey 0-0 ensued against Birmingham, then Portsmouth caused them problems yet again. Jose Antonio Reyes pitched in with perhaps the most meaningful contribution in an Arsenal shirt with a second half equaliser. And so the quirky stat read that the two clubs the Arsenal Invincibles failed to beat that season were Manchester United across 2 league draws, a penalty loss in the Community Shield, as well as the FA Cup semi-final, and Portsmouth, thanks to 2 1-1 draws in the league. Reyes netted again 5 days later, the sole goal in a win at Fulham which left 1 match, and surely the icing on the cake, the already relegated piss-poor Leicester City at Highbury. If you could have 1 match to become invincible, it would be this. A nervy Arsenal went in, however, 1-0 at the break, thanks to a Paul Dickoff goal of all things. Luckily, the Gunners won and converted a penalty before a Robert Pires winner put everything beyond doubt. Arsenal were invincible and they had their unique golden Premier League trophy. The Gunners would retain their invincibility until October 2004 when they were beaten at Old Trafford, thanks to another dodgy penalty, Ruud van Nistelrooy, and yet another haunting by Wayne Rooney. They went 49 matches without defeat in the league, eclipsing all such feats before it, and it has never come close to being replicated since. Sure, it's an overused term thanks to The Dark Knight and Batman, but Arsene Wenger really did live long enough at the Emirates Stadium to see himself become the villain. This was a man punished by his own success. It was only the 3 championships in 6 years, the Champions League final, the outlandish amount of FA Cup silverware and the planting of the Arsenal flag as a Premier team in the Premier League that necessitated a move from Highbury. Parts of the old ground held protected status, and therefore little to no renovation by way of a capacity increase was possible. So just as Wenger taught the Premier League strict dietary requirements and cutting-edge supplement programmes, so too would he bequeath these Isles a new version of the football stadium. The Emirates was funded throughout the mid-2000s, as the Invincibles were pristine on the equally pristine Highbury turf. Then in 2006, the Emirates opened for its first fixture. 2006, a time which coincided with a sea change at the club. Patrick Vieira was already in the rear-view mirror, signing off with a penalty in his last kick in an Arsenal shirt to win the 2005 FA Cup final against mortal enemies Manchester United. Robert Pires wouldn't see the new stadium either. His early substitution in the Champions League final was the final nail in the coffin for the Frenchman. Ashley Cole couldn't resist the affection and ambition from across town and would move upwards to Chelsea, just as Arsenal, thanks to the sales of Sol Campbell, Thierry Henry and Freddie Ljungberg, slunk down the pecking order. Waiting for them, unlike in 1998, unlike in 2002, wasn't a fresh unit ready to take on the league. What awaited the Emirates Stadium was a conglomeration of the invincible leftovers and a fearless brand of player, albeit shorn of experience. Arsene Wenger is adamant that there was money left in the transfer budget to sign new players and, with club finances in mind, learned to be stringent with the cash. Irrespective of whether money was there or not, Wenger was caught standing still. Now swimming against the tide with the moment already past, he didn't stray from his strategy of promoting from within, signing young and signing the obscure. It delivered a team like Jack Wilshere, Aaron Ramsey, Gail Clichy, Robin van Persie and Theo Walcott, to name a few. This was a time where financial boundaries were being broken down across the capital, which sparked fears of financial doping and the future of the sport. Roman Abramovich, in the words of David Dein, was firing £50 banknotes from his tank at the club as Chelsea spent into the billions to quench the thirst of their new Russian owner. Arsenal could simply not compete. When Sheikh Mansour pitched up at Manchester City 5 years later, the die was already cast for Arsenal. They won nothing between 2005 and 2014 went backwards and had to be satisfied with the steady trickle of money that merely appearing in the Champions League knockouts demanded. Just when a plan would seem in place, the rug got whipped out from under Wenger. When the youth of the 2000s became the men of the 2010s, the crew deserted him when Samir Nasri, Cesc Fabregas and Robin van Persie left in the space of 12 months. When money started to be spent on the likes of Mesut Ozil and Alexis Sanchez and a welcome return to silverware in the shape of 3 FA Cups in 4 years, the competition ratcheted up one more notch. By the time Pep Guardiola and Jurgen Klopp prepared for a duopoly the like of which the Premier League hadn't seen since the final flurry of Wenger and Ferguson, Wenger was spent. The more entertaining battles that concerned Arsenal in these years weren't on the dugout or on the pitch, but they were on this very website. The greater thinkers of our day congealed to form Arsenal Fan TV, a bastion of the ordinary man on the street. To hell with a generation of groundwork and a golden age the like of which the club has never seen and will likely never experience again. You either became a Wenger out or remained a loyalist to the greatest servant Arsenal had ever seen. Luckily for the club, by the time the Gunners misfired into the Europa League and Arsene Wenger departed, they had already experienced what they now call the banter years. They would not suffer the same fate as Manchester United up north when they tried to replace a generational manager, if you forget about Unai Emery and half of Mikel Arteta's tenure that is. Now Arsenal are fighting on all fronts once again. They're challenging for the Premier League, they're back in the conversation for the Champions League, and those modern totemic figures of Klopp and Guardiola are completing their final laps of the league circuit. The window is opening and Arsenal are right there waiting, just like in 1996 when Wenger arrived.